Sign. I guess not everybody's here. Enough for here. I'm going to go, I want to just make sure I have the final roll call set. So before we do anything, I'm just going to run down the list of names to go from there, okay? So, Raihuna Atokarjeva. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing that right. She's not here.
She's coming.
Okay, she's coming. Okay. John Sipperly? Is it Sipperly? Soft C? Okay, cool. Maya Daniels? No Maya Daniels? Samia Edwards? Kirsten Evans? Okay, very good. John Boyer? Sarah Grondin? Okay. Ada Hatibovich? Really? Jurgen? I think I said it right there. Mariel Leonard? Okay. Are you new to that? No, you've been here?
I wasn't here last week. I emailed you. I was sick.
Yeah, okay. I remember you. Thank you. Richard McManus. Got it. Wynn Monroe. Thank you. Adisa Muse. Balin Ortiz Escadio. Anybody here? No? Claudia Hatan. Okay. Lincoln Phillips. Hi, Lincoln. Joseph Riddle. Okay. Sonia Sadra. Okay. Serena Snyder. Okay. All right. Very good. So the plan for today, we are going to talk about theories of economic growth. But before we jump into that, it is with great pleasure that I announce we have the luxury of a fantastic teaching assistant for this course. Evan, do you want to perhaps come to the front and say hello to everybody? So this is Mr. Evan Hume. He'll be your teaching assistant over the duration of the course. I believe you sent an email to everybody today, right?
Yes, if you didn't receive an email from me through Blackboard, please let me know during the break or after class and I'll try and get that fixed.
Great. Evan he majored in biology on an ROTC scholarship at Duke University. We don't hold his basketball affiliation against him in this class, though. He was commissioned as a Marine Corps officer. He served on active duty on both coasts and overseas, including Iraq and Okinawa. He was assigned as an instructor to the Officer Candidate School down in Quantico, which is actually where I met Evan so many years ago. And from there, he decided he would explore career opportunities at SAIS. At SAIS, he was a strategic studies concentrator, and he got A's in every economics course he took, which I didn't know until after I hired him, but that's always a good sign, including this course. At SAIS, Evan founded the SAIS Leadership Initiative, and he was also voted by all of his peers in the 2011 graduating class to receive the William C. Foster Award for Integrity, Loyalty, and Ability. So you all are very lucky to have Evan now, and he's also a major in the U.S. Marine Corps as a reserve officer. Correct? Cool. So anyway, Evan will be he's available for office hours. You can send him an email to figure that out. And his email is evan.hume at Hotmail?
Correct.
evan.hume@hotmail.com. And he will be holding TA sessions on a regular basis to discuss some of the more gritty nuances of the course. Okay? Secondly, some of you didn't complete surveys yet, or just filled out the first side of your survey. So that includes Rehana, Samia, Mariel, Richard, Claudia, Sonia, and Serena. So if you could stick around after class for a couple minutes just to finish your survey, I'd greatly appreciate that. And I will also assign your problem set at the end of class. I'll pass it out, and it will be due not this Thursday, but the following Thursday. Okay? We'll hand that out to class, and I'll tell you more about it therein. Okay? And before we jump into the lecture, I also found 2 articles that I thought you might enjoy. One on China, one on the Eurozone. And we'll talk about these briefly at the end of class, but I want you to have them now. They're from today's Financial Times, and they directly pertain to the issues of economic growth. And so, thank you. New system?
Next system would be MUC.
All right. So before we begin, are there any questions at all for anything we covered last week? None? All right. Well, the plan today is to go over 4 of the major models of economic growth. We're going to start with the basic growth model. We're going to talk about the Herod-Domar growth model. We will talk about Rostow's 5 stages of economic growth, or the Rostovian takeoff model. And finally, we'll end with the beginnings of the solo growth model. We'll see how far we get into that. That is a little more math intensive, so that's just depending on how long the first part of the course takes. Okay? So that said, issue number 1, the introduction. Economists have been obsessed with one great puzzle really since the founding of economics as a discipline. And that, of course, is the puzzle of the differences in income between rich countries and poor countries. Nobel Prize winning economist Bob Lucas claimed, once one starts to think about economic growth, it's hard to think about anything else, this vexing problem of why certain countries go rich, why others stagnate. And so, so far in this course, up until today, we have emphasized 2 broad processes by which countries grow economically. So who remembers what those are? 2 broad processes. Jürgen?
Through labor and through capital.
Okay, so
Not
first and
function.
foremost, capital accumulation.
Yeah.
So we have per capita income on our y-axis. We have capital per capita on our x-axis. And so economies can grow by a process of capital deepening, right? By investing in the capital stock of an economy, they can grow the productive base of resources in the economy, which in turn leads to increases in per capita income. What quality does this particular production function show? Diminishing returns to capital. Each incremental unit of capital yields ever-falling incremental amounts of output, such that the economy can't simply accumulate capital forever and grow forever. There's a natural limit to this.
Can it go negative?
I'm sorry?
Can it go negative?
Usually we treat it as asymptotic, so we basically say that it levels off. Very rarely do we say that it just falls off a cliff. Theoretically it could go negative, but the mathematical forms we use don't allow it to. Okay? Good question. So that's one way. Capital accumulation. What's the other way? Sam?
Increases in productivity.
Exactly. Increases in capital, and then increases in what we call total factor productivity. Increases in total factor productivity is another way by which economies grow. Yes?
And does that include technological change?
Absolutely it does. Which includes technological change. For those of you who did your reading, you recognize this is the solo residual, which was discussed by your authors. So increases in total factor productivity. If increases in capital are movement along, are shown by moving along the curve of our production function, how might we show increases in total factor productivity? Show of hands. You notice. Yeah, Wayne?
Well, I guess it's not really like necessarily a shift up, but it's like a increased slope of the curve, right?
Well, it depends what your units are. If you're talking about effective workers, effective capital versus the actual stocks. But just for the sake of simplicity, we actually do.
Yeah.
So I will say this is y1, y2. Okay? So think about what we're saying when we have an increase in total factor productivity. An increase in total factor productivity is equivalent of an increase in the overall level of efficiency in our factors of production. We can do more with the same amount of inputs. Right? And you can see this graphically. Let's say we are K1. Before the increase in total factor productivity, we could produce Y1. And now with that exact same amount, we can produce Y2. Our pre-existing capital stock can go farther. Okay? And that's what we spent a lot of time talking about on Thursday. And so to summarize, we can grow through two ways. One, either the accumulation of assets, okay? That's this, accumulation of assets, be it labor, capital stock, land, other inputs of the factors of production. Okay, that's the left panel. Or we can actually make those inputs more productive, more efficient. And that's increases in total factor productivity. Okay? The two sources of economic growth. And of course, we spend a little bit of time talking about why savings and investment are critical to these processes. Who can remind me why? Why must one save to invest? Or why is it important? Yep.
Ex post investment and savings are the same.
Yes, that's correct. So investment and savings are the same. So if you save more, you invest more. But why does that matter for economic growth?
Because personal savings that translates to national savings at some point.
Okay, but then what's the link to productive capability? Yeah, when?
Investment creates capital.
Exactly. Okay, here's the key. If capital deepening is the byproduct of investment. Okay? Yeah, question?
Are we talking about a closed economy?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep. In a closed economy. Or another way to think about it, in the world economy. Right? All savings has to equal investment, and so all investment will lead to capital deepening worldwide. Because we don't trade with Mars, is the joke goes. Okay? So good. So again, savings is key here. So as we'll see in each of these models, savings plays a very important role in explaining capital deepening and thus economic growth. Okay, so you're going to see, and we'll be a little more specific in our math behind it, but that's an important lesson there. Okay? Now, one of the keys to this lecture is understanding the difference between the level of output and the rate of change of output. Okay? So which figure do economists probably care more about when we're talking about advanced countries? Rate of change, right? What do you constantly read stories about in the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times? It's about GDP growth, okay? You don't read article headlines that say that the Bureau of Economic Analysis found that GDP was 14 trillion last quarter. They said the GDP expanded at a rate of 3% annualized, okay? So, these two are, of course, intricately linked. And what you'll see is that we will spend much more time focused on the rate of change of output because growth leads to higher levels of income economy-wide. Okay? And there are, does everybody understand the difference between these conceptually? Okay, there's just the way we describe these mathematically. Total output we say is Y, total income, total output, we treat that as the same. Okay? The rate of change we typically say is delta Y over Y. Okay? This is the equivalent of just a percentage change, right? This is the rate of change. Yep. Okay. We'll also say that the rate of change is G, or some growth rate. Okay. Another way to express the rate of change is using a derivative. The notation being the change in output with respect to the change in time. Okay? If you have no idea what this is yet, it's okay. We're going to cover it subsequently. But for those of you who know derivatives, what we're basically saying is that the incremental change of output with an incremental change in time, we think of it. Okay? So both of those are different ways of conceiving of these two related concepts. Okay? Now, one note before we jump into the models. Okay? We base many of our models in a series of assumptions that simplify the real world to isolate core relationships between variables. Okay? Even the snarkiest of commentators namely Dr. Easterly, who you're reading, would admit that very few people take these models and just apply them blindly to every case in the world. Okay? They are very highly stylized, we base them on assumptions, and then we relax those assumptions to come to different conclusions. That's exactly what we'll be doing in this lecture. Okay? So any questions on that overview? Everybody understand the difference between levels of output versus the rate of change, diminishing returns, the difference between capital accumulation and total factor productivity? Those concepts are clear? Okay, good. We're going to use those a lot in issue number 2. You're talking about the basic growth model. All right. So in the basic growth model, at the core of the basic growth model are several equations. There are 5 of them. And so what I'm going to do is put them on the board and explain them to you. Okay? So the first major equation we use is our standard production function. Now what did I say? We are going to simplify the real world. Okay? And this is a core simplification. We're saying that output, y, is a function of simply 2 variables. Capital accumulation and the total size of the labor force. That's it. Okay? Now obviously there's land, there's natural resources, there's tons of different other variables, but these are the 2 we're going to pick because it's easier to represent functions in 2-dimensional spaces as opposed to 6-dimensional spaces. Okay? So any questions on our basic production function? Okay. Furthermore, we claim that all economies have some level of aggregate savings. That level of aggregate savings is equal to some savings rate times income. Some savings rate, which is little cursive s, times total income. Okay. So in the United States, what's that percent? 0? Okay. It's very low, right? What's it in Germany?
A lot higher.
A lot higher? So austerity is popular there, right? So understand that this is just some percentage, okay? We'll usually give that to you. We're also talking about savings and investment in the closed economy. Okay? Recall that in a closed economy, all savings has to equal investment. Now understand why that's the case. Recall that on Thursday, we gave you the national income accounting equation. Okay? What does this state? It states that in any closed economy, okay, income, y, or output, y, is equal to total consumption, c. Right? That's economic activity conducted by households, individuals. Then we have investment, I, which is economic activity on behalf of firms and businesses. And finally, we have G, which is government expenditure. Okay? We claim further, if we rearrange this, y minus c minus g equals I. Y minus c minus g is equal to national savings. And therefore, all savings has to equal investment in a closed economy. Okay? It's just a basic accounting identity that we actually take from macroeconomics. So if any of you take macro or are going to take it, this will be about a good half of the course. Okay? So those are the 3 major equations thus far. The 4th is something known as the law of motion of capital. Everybody get this down? There it is. So the law of motion of capital says that in any given time period, usually we say, in any given year, the change in capital stock is equal capital addition, capital subtraction. We say that the change in capital stock in any given year is the difference between however much we add to the capital stock in a given year minus however much of our capital stock, for whatever reason, withers away. Okay? I believe your book calls this capital deepening, and I think the term is capital widening. Okay? Capital deepening, capital widening. So, in any given period, we're going to add to our capital stock, and we're going to take some capital stock away. Now, what are some reasons why the capital stock, the pre-existing capital stock, might be worth less in a given year? What's the biggest reason? Depreciation. So what we'll claim here is that the second half of this equation is expressed by lowercase delta times the pre-existing capital stock from that prior period. And what did I say about the relationship between investment and the capital stock? In any given period, the addition to the capital stock comes from investment. So we can say that this is investment minus the depreciation of the capital stock gives us delta K. Furthermore, we can substitute in for investment, and we could say savings equal savings minus depreciation times capital stock gives us delta K, or simply little s times big Y minus depreciation times big K equals delta K. Everybody see that? What's that fourth equation? Now, what's the relationship between delta K and income? Anybody? I hear a couple
Any
mumbles.
change in capital actually reduces change in income, whether you subtract or you add.
Good.
It affects income anyways.
Very good. So if we add to the capital stock in a given period, i.e. if delta K is greater than 0, what's the sign on delta Y? Positive. So is delta K is greater than 0, we say that delta Y is greater than 0. Why is this the case? Because income is a positive function of capital accumulation and a positive function of additions or related. Make sense, everybody? So if we are accumulating capital, or if savings times income is greater, this term right here is greater than our depreciation of the capital stock, true or false, we'll have economic growth. This greater than this, true. Okay? What if the first term is less than the second? We will have economic contraction, right? Delta Y will be less than 0. And what if they equal each other? What kind of condition will that be? Flat, no growth. Okay? So that's how the law of motion of capital is derived, and that's how it relates to income. Any questions on that? If you understand this relationship very well, the solo growth model becomes very easy. Okay?
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
I could be wrong, but I thought you said that capital subtraction was capital widening.
Capital widening. I think broadening is the term. I believe.
All right. Capital widening is when the population grows, but capital keeps pace.
Yeah, exactly. It gets diluted, you could think of, across a greater
So it's not really
population.
subtraction as much as it's like maintenance.
Yeah, you can think of it that way.
So,
I think when we introduce population growth and talk in per capita terms, it'll make a little more
all
sense.
right, so capital substitution. I thought you said capital was like capital widening, but if you said it's not, it's something else.
That's on per capita terms. Just think of this as purely just depreciation
All right.
in the basic growth model. Okay. When we bring it back to solo, I think that'll be a little clearer. And finally, we claim that our population, our rate of change of population, delta L, is equal to some little n times L.
Could I interrupt for a second? What did you say the small letter delta means?
That's some depreciation
Some
rate.
depreciation.
Yep. The greater the depreciation rate, the bigger drag on the change in capital stock. Okay? If you build a machine and then tomorrow it's a third as productive, that's a very large depreciation. Yeah? In term n here, okay, this is our final equation. The change in the labor stock in any given period is equal to some population growth rate, n, times capital, times the labor force, L. Okay? So to do a quick summary, savings, in particular the savings rate, the depreciation rate, and the population growth rate are all percentages. Okay? Their values between 0 and 1. Okay? We don't give you exorbitantly high population growth rates to mess you up. So, in the basic growth model then, we can actually solve for certain quantities, such as what is the rate of change in our capital stock in a given period, given certain variables. So if I were to tell you that the savings rate is equal to 20%, the population growth rate is equal to 2%, the depreciation rate is equal to 5%. Income is equal to 10 billion. And our capital stock is equal to 30 billion. And I want to know what's the rate of change of our capital stock in this given period. How would I go about doing that? Which equation would I use? If I want to know the change in capital stock in a given period. Number 4, right? So delta K is equal to S times Y minus depreciation times K. Or delta K is equal to 0.2 times 10 billion minus 0.05 times 30 billion. And this is equal to 0.5 billion in a given period. Okay? I know this seems like an obvious mathematical operation, but this is necessary for laying the groundwork for some of the algebra that you'll be doing in the solo growth model. Okay? So that is the basic growth model. Okay? A key insight here is that many of these equations have per capita analogs. Okay? Meaning that we can model, for instance, in equation number 4, with a certain modification, the rate of change of the capital stock per worker. Okay? And we can take income per worker, capital stock per worker to figure this out. Okay? Why do we care about both? Well, because we're in the business of economic development, and we don't just care about the total size of the pie. We care about the slice of the pie that people get on average. Okay? So that's why we care about things in per capita terms. All right? Any questions on the basic model? Yeah.
Can you just quickly label all of these 1 through 5?
Just like signpost them, or?
Well, it's standard production function, aggregate savings, national savings.
You call this the law of motion of capital,
law of motion.
and then just the change in the size of the labor force over time. All right. So that brings me to the Herod-Domar growth model, issue number 3. Okay, so the Herod-Domar growth model. This is the most basic production function we could give you. Okay, and most of the debate in economic growth and of economic theory centers around the production function. Okay, the relationship between outputs and inputs in a given economy. Now, this function can take many forms depending on what we believe the true relationship is between the factors of production and output. Now, this relationship depends on many things. It depends on the mix of economic activities, agriculture, heavy industry, labor-intensive industries, capital-intensive industries, etc. The level of technology and other factors like institutions, climate, education, natural resources, etc. Now, we assume a very simplified production function in the Herod-Domar model. And we assume a fixed coefficient production function. Okay. Now, we have a way of modeling a relationship between inputs and outputs graphically. Okay? We use isoquants. Isoquants simply give us relationships between different combinations of capital and labor that yield the same amount of output. I'll repeat. Any given isoquant tells us the different combinations of capital and labor that yield a given amount of output. The best way to see this is graphically. So here we have two isoquants. They are kinked at the following points. 10 and 5. And 10 and 20. So we have two inputs, labor and capital, and each isoquant has some constant level of output along every single point on that isoquant. So the first one, is there glare? You guys have problems seeing that? No? Okay. Q1, quantity 1, is equal to 1,000. And so at the kink point, we assume that 5 units of capital and 10 units of labor produce 1,000 units of output at this point. Now, this is a fixed coefficient production function. To illustrate what that means, I ask you a hypothetical. If we hold capital constant at 5, can we have more output by simply adding more labor? No. Okay? So that's the essence of the fixed coefficient production function. Labor and capital have to be used in constant proportions, regardless of how much you produce, such that holding any given input, don't write this down word for word, okay? Holding any given input constant, subsequent increases in the other input do not increase our total level of quantity produced. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah, question?
I mean, I think I understand it, but it's counterintuitive.
Okay.
And so, I mean, why would one even have such a theory built into the model?
Sure. Two things. One, sheer simplicity. You'll see when we get into the actual algebraic side of this growth model, it makes for very clean and very precise conclusions based on this simplifying assumption. And two, dare I say, it sometimes mimics reality. Now, this is from the standpoint of producing, right? But usually, when you have inputs that are highly complementary to one another, think left shoes and right shoes, okay? Left skates and right skates, if you like hockey, okay? You can only consume those in fixed proportions, okay? If you have 3 left skates and 4 right skates and have a 5th left skate, that's not gonna, you can't substitute away from that, right? So that perfect complementarity of inputs is expressed here, and that allows us to do other things that we won't be doing today, or probably ever, but it's a simplifying assumption that leads to other convenient avenues of economic analysis. Okay? So, when I say we have a fixed proportion or fixed coefficient production function, what we mean is that the ratio of the inputs relative to one another is constant for any level of production chosen. That particular ratio is given by the slope of the ray of the line, and we can see here that we consume 2 units of labor for every 1 unit of capital, and that proportion is maintained throughout. Okay? So that is the isoplot. Any questions on that? We're going to be working with that quite a bit when we get to solo. Okay? Now, the most efficient allocation on each isoplot always takes place at the elbow, okay? Because you have to pay for inputs. And so the cheapest combination of producing 1,000 units of output will always take place here. Why would you ever hire an additional unit of capital or additional unit of labor if you can't substitute the proportions between the two of them? Okay? So any other point chosen here is inefficient. Now, this production function, or as it's drawn, exhibits something known as constant returns to scale. How many of you guys have heard this term before? Yeah? So, returns to scale relates, first of all, it's a long-run concept, okay? And it relates the long-run production of a good to the use of inputs in producing that good. In particular, it tells us what will happen to output if we change the total amount of inputs employed. We have a way of showing this mathematically. We have some function of capital and labor and some output y. We have 3 types of returns to scale. Constant returns to scale claim that if we were to double both inputs, we would exactly double output. 2k times 2l will give us 2y. That's exactly what we have drawn here. Okay? Double labor, double capital, double output. Constant returns to scale. Okay? Call this CRTS. We have increasing returns to scale, which would be if we were to double capital and double labor. This would more than double output, let's just say 3y. Be increasing returns to scale. And finally, we have decreasing returns to scale, which is if we were to double capital and double labor, we would less than double output. Okay? Now, why do returns to scale matter from development? You know, just taking a step back and, yeah, okay, yes, we assume constant returns to scale because that simplifies a lot of things, but why do we care about returns to scale? Yeah, Win?
Because investment might not give us the capital accumulation we want. It might give us less, for example, or capital accumulation might produce less growth than we want.
Sure. So this tells us something about the role of capital accumulation in determining economic growth. That's absolutely true. Like if you were to pick up the newspaper and read about China, they'll tell you that China capitalizes on scale economies. Right? Their urbanization has allowed them to capitalize on scale economies. How might that relate to this concept? How might this relate to the costs of firms? That's another way of thinking about it. Yeah?
Labor gets cheaper because they have more.
Sure, so something about having large pools of urbanized labor might decrease average costs of production. Average cost, labor. Hire more labor, average costs go down. Now why is that pertinent from the viewpoint of economic development?
Because you can employ more people, so employment goes down.
Okay, so you can employ more people and that will also drag down the price of whatever they're producing, which might actually feed into your comparative advantage. And from the standpoint of trade competition, that's a really good thing. Okay? So returns to scale, this concept constantly creeps up in determining different countries' production profiles, welfare inside of developing countries. This is a very important concept for that. Okay? Okay. But we are assuming constant returns to scale for this model. Now, if we assume constant returns to scale, we also assume that two more ratios must remain constant at every level of output. The first is capital to output. The second is labor to output. This stems from the fact that capital and labor are used in equal proportions. Therefore, their ratio individually, capital to output and labor to output, must remain constant over time. Now, this fixed coefficient constant returns to scale production function that's depicted here, okay, forms the centerpiece of a well-known early model of economic growth that was developed in the 1940s. Roy Harrod of the United Kingdom and Evry Domar at MIT tried in particular to understand growth in advanced capitalist economies. Okay, so they tried to create this model to understand why rich countries grew. It's somewhat paradoxical and ironic that we use it to understand why poor countries grow. And those conditions that they assume is first, labor is abundant. Okay, they assume labor abundance. And they in turn assume that capital is the binding constraint for growth. If you want to understand why countries don't grow, don't look to their lack of labor, look to their lack of capital. Okay? When were they writing this? Well, they were writing this after World War II. The experience of the Great Depression was fresh on their minds, and they had an industrial reserve army of laborers because of the Great Depression. And so, based on their empirical experience, they understood that labor abundance was a natural fact of life. Obviously, this might not be the case today, but, well, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, maybe it is. But certainly in the 1990s, that wasn't the case. Okay? Now, we assume in the Harrod-Domar model that output is a linear function of capital. Output is a linear function of capital, and only capital. And the way we express this is through the Harrod-Domar production function. So we assume that y is a function of capital divided by some v. This is the Harrod-Domar production function. Is a linear function of capital. Accumulation.
What does V stand for?
We'll get to that. So this V term, okay, is considered the capital to output ratio. Rearranging this equation, we get V is equal to K over Y. does this mean? You could think of V as a proxy for the efficiency of production in a given economy. Why might that be the case? V can be considered a proxy of the productivity of capital, or the productivity of investment. Why is that the case?
It depends, the output then depends on the efficiency of the use of capital.
Output depends on the efficiency. Yes, that's true, but why?
Because it you earlier said that the output is the linear function of the capital. That's one.
Okay.
There's no other-
Well, there's a causal link between those two conclusions. So, think of it this way. The greater V, okay, the greater amount of capital we have to use to produce a given amount of output. The higher V is, the greater our capital to output ratio. Okay? The greater the capital intensity of our output.
And the lower your efficiency.
Yes, exactly it. And in turn, the lower the efficiency of capital. So, all other things equal, do we want a high V or low V? Low V, okay? Think about it this way, the lower V, the greater Y, right? The reasoning being, it refers to this notion of the efficiency of our capital. The capital to income ratio thus provides an indication of the capital intensity of the production process. Now, there are many reasons why this V term might vary over different economies, okay? The first reason relates to the use of unequal technologies in producing the same good. Okay? We might use different technologies to produce the same good, which relates to the differences in capital efficiency across countries. Okay? Textile production in India is far more labor intensive than it is in the Philippines, for instance. Okay. Also, different countries, for whatever reason, produce a different mix of goods, and they simply have different levels of efficiency that might just be completely exogenously determined. Okay? Now, how this equation relates to economic growth is thus. Economists can calculate the incremental capital to output ratio. Incremental capital to output ratio. And we call this term I-core. Okay? The I-core is a measure of the productivity of additional capital. Okay? In the Herod-Domar model, we assume the I-core is constant. The I-core in the Herod-Domar model is simply equal to that V, the incremental capital to output ratio. Okay? The greater the I-core, the less productive a country's productive process is. Because you need more capital for every incremental amount of extra output being received. Yeah, what the I-core is?
No, the greater the I-core, the less productive.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, the greater, yes. The greater the I-core, the less productive the production process is. Okay? So, based on everything I've said, we can come up with a basic equation of economic growth in the Herod-Domar model. So let's start with our production function. First, we can claim that K divided by V is equal to Y. That's our basic production function. From there, we can make this dynamic and say that the change in output is equal to some change in capital stock, again divided by that V. Think back to your basic model. What did we say? delta K and delta Y are correlated with one another. The greater delta K, i.e. the more capital we accumulate, the greater the impact on output. Okay? Furthermore, this is what I said in the introduction, recall that the growth rate of a given economy is equal to delta Y over Y. And thus, substituting in equations 2 and 3, we can claim that the rate of growth of a given economy is equal to delta K over Y times V. Okay? So all we're doing is substituting in for delta Y. Okay? From here. Make sense? Now, from here, we can simplify further. Does everybody understand how we got to step 3? Okay. We can claim that delta K over Y times V is really equal to S times Y minus depreciation times K over Y times V. Think back to equation number 4 for the basic model. We're just substituting in the law of motion of capital for delta K. Remember that? Okay. So we'll call equation A. Equation B. We can simplify further until we get to an equation G equals S over V minus depreciation. If you're wondering on how this term simplifies to B, take a look in your book. I believe it's page 108 in the footnote. They can show you the derivation. Also, your teaching assistant would be happy to show you how we get from A to B. Okay? Got that in? Okay. So, this is the upshot of the Herod-Domar growth model. Okay? G, the rate of growth of an economy, is equal to the savings rate divided by the I-core minus depreciation. So what are the keys then to determining the rate of economic growth in the Herod-Domar model? Well, let's just look at each of these variables. The first is, we will have, under ceteris paribus conditions, holding all else equal, if we have a higher savings rate, we will have a higher growth rate. Savings is thus central to this model. The higher the savings rate, the higher the growth rate. Secondly, the higher depreciation is, the lower the growth rate. Because we have to compensate for depreciation of our capital stock. The greater the depreciation, the more we're losing of our capital stock, which is a drag on growth. Finally, we have term V. The more productive our capital stock, i.e. the lower V is, the lower our I-core, the greater economic growth will be.
Can you repeat the last part?
Sure. The more efficient our capital stock is, i.e. the lower our I-core is, or V as we have in the equation, the higher our growth rate. The conclusion being, the more efficiently we use capital relative to output, the faster we'll grow. The higher our savings rate, the faster we'll grow. The lower the depreciation rate, the faster we'll grow. Those are the three main conclusions of the Herod-Domar model. Okay. Any questions on the I-core, how it relates to the conclusion of the Herod-Domar model? This is the most important equation. Circle it in your notes. It might creep up on future learning celebrations. Yeah. What's that? Yeah, that's my euphemism for the midterm. Yeah.
Sorry, could you just match the notes to the letters? The higher the savings rate, which is S, the
Yep.
higher the growth, which is G.
Yep.
The higher depreciation, which is delta, the lower the growth rate, which is G.
Yep.
The more efficient the K stock is,
Yep.
which one would that be?
That'd be V. The lower V is, and in turn, higher growth. Okay?
Or when you said the more efficient, you meant lower, okay.
Yeah.
The higher,
That's why V is kind of counterintuitive, because it varies inversely to efficiency. Okay?
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
What is the name of the variable you're using for D in these equations?
Right here,
All right, that's not a letter D.
that's a delta, lowercase delta.
All right, lowercase delta. All right.
Yeah. You can find it in the symbols of Microsoft Word. And yeah, it's just a kind of uniform.
Well, it doesn't match up with what's in the book, so that's,
Oh, they just use a plain lowercase d?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, question?
Yes, I don't understand the, when you talk about V, that the more productive your capital stock becomes, is gonna lead to a higher growth rate. I thought in this model, the capital stock to output, the ratio never changes.
It's exogenously determined. So you're right, it doesn't change, but that's because in this model, we don't tell you how it changes, okay? We just say it's dependent on that factor. But if you want to grow faster, however you get there, make your capital stock more productive. We don't give you an endogenous theory for why capital stock can become more productive. Does that make sense? So, okay, everybody cool on this? Okay, now what are the strengths of this model? Well, the first is there is a core optimism of this model. Growth can go on forever. Okay? There is no bound to growth. Because production of total income is a linear function of capital stock, growth can continue ad infinitum. Secondly, there is a great deal of simplicity to this model. The data requirements are small, the equation is easy to use and to estimate. The final strength of this model is its emphasis on savings. Okay? In the central role that savings plays. If you want to understand why countries grow rich fast, look into how much they're savings, because that relates to their capital accumulation, which relates to their rate of economic growth. Now, as he is known to do, Easterly has many critiques of this model. Just to name a few, Easterly claims that this model actually has too narrow a focus on savings, implying that savings is a necessary and sufficient condition for growth. Okay? What Easterly claims is, look, if savings leads to investment, this model assumes that investment is productive. Sometimes you might make bad investment decisions, which are unproductive. Furthermore, it ignores the role of government. Yeah, Sam?
But wouldn't the idea of investment not being productive be captured in B?
Investment not being productive. Yeah, that's fair. I guess this takes